All right, today we're going to review for the final exam. I'm just going to go over everything that I want you to focus on and give you a brief sort of summary of what's important from each reading. So, starting with the first chapter that we read in the second half of the class, we were looking at euthanasia, and you should know all of the main forms of euthanasia: active versus passive euthanasia, voluntary versus non-voluntary euthanasia. Active and passive are two distinct forms of ultimately physician-assisted suicide. Know that a little bit about the American Medical Association's position in 1972. They condemned the practice of active euthanasia and how that's sort of a controversial position. No, just something about the legality of active euthanasia insofar as it's illegal in most states, but there are a few states where it is legal, and the trend is starting to change a little bit to where there are states that are legalizing it more and more frequently. And then, of course, the Netherlands has the most liberal active euthanasia laws. Just know a little bit about that stuff, but primarily I want you to know the difference between active and passive euthanasia, voluntary, non-voluntary euthanasia, and then like things like, be able to put them together, like active voluntary or active non-voluntary euthanasia. So, for example, something like active voluntary euthanasia would be employing the help of a physician to hasten one's death. Active non-voluntary euthanasia would be, and this is very rare, it doesn't happen often, if at all, where physicians would decide on behalf of a patient who couldn't make the decision on their own to terminate their life. Now, that's different than ceasing extraordinary measures, which would be that would be passive non-voluntary euthanasia. That would be a situation where somebody doesn't have any advance directives or any next of kin, and they find themselves in quite likely like an accident, and they're in a persistent vegetative state, and there's no reasonable hope for recovery, so the case has been deemed medically futile, and a team of physicians and quite possibly a board of ethicists would say that they would be employing extraordinary measures. It would be inhumane to keep the person alive when they may be brain dead or in a persistent vegetative state, so they decide to pull them off a respirator. That's passive involuntary euthanasia. So there's a major distinction between passive and active voluntary euthanasia. So just know that stuff. The readings from that chapter, James Rachel's, I'd like you to focus on that. That's a pretty important reading. That's where you had that Jones and Smith analogy, talking about the useless distinction between active and passive euthanasia. They're both basically have the same teleological focus, like there's the exact same end. One is just more humane than the other. Rachel's is saying that active euthanasia is more humane. If you know the patient is going to die anyway, you might as well make it quicker so they don't suffer. That's the gist of the Rachel's argument. And the Jones-Smith analogy talks about, in sort of an inverse way, the morality of killing with intent or letting somebody die with the same intent. So that's going to be an important reading. I'd like you to focus on that. The other reading was, let me think, Gay Williams, and he made a pretty concise argument. It wasn't the most powerful logic, but it was a well-written article. That's where he gives all the various reasons for the wrongfulness of euthanasia. The argument from practical effects, where he talks about the effects in the medical community. He talks about the biology, the inherent teleology of the body, how its defenses kick in to stay alive, and how this counters that, and all of that. So just know the main themes from the Gay Williams piece. So that's what I'd like you to focus on for the euthanasia chapter, but mainly the Rachel's article. Okay. Next chapter was abortion. Just know a little bit about the law, Roe v. Wade. We talked about that. Know about the trimesters. and how Roe v. Wade established those trimesters and how that impacted the way we understand that. Primarily, though, for that chapter, I'd like you to focus on the Judith Jarvis Thompson article in defense of abortion. That was a landmark piece of philosophy that really had a lot of influence on the Supreme Court's use of the 14th Amendment to interpret the law. And this is where Judith Jarvis Thompson talks about, and I'll just go over this very briefly, talks about how she can make a case for legalized abortion even if we were to all agree that the fetus was a person at the moment of conception, which she says is not true. However, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to the argument that she's making, which is basically saying that a mother is acting as sort of a vessel for the unborn child. And using that violinist analogy, she's saying that it's unreasonable to ask somebody to sustain someone's life if they don't want to do it. That's essentially what that violinist analogy is saying. So there's no laws that require anybody to be a good Samaritan or even a minimally decent Samaritan. So she's saying that we can't require somebody to keep somebody else alive to sustain the life of another person. That's the gist of the argument. So there's the violinist analogy, there's the Peter Fonda, there's the people seeds, all of those different thought experiments all sort of work to establish the same point, which is that there are no other instances where we ask another person to sustain a life against their will. Don Marquis is writing against abortion, and the gist of his argument is that when we kill a fetus, we're depriving it of a future like ours. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be putting a question on the final on that particular reading because it's not that important of a reading. So really what we'd probably be focusing on is the Judith Jarvis Thompson and the James Rachel so far. Those are the ones that I think are the most important. I'd like you to know the other two. I can't promise I won't put like one question on there, but the Judith Jarvis Thompson and the James Rachels are the key pieces from those two chapters. Okay, moving on. From there, what did we get into? Economic justice. So from there we got into economic justice. You don't have to know too much about like the theories that I talked about. Like, I mean, you obviously, in order to be able to even do this, you have to know about capitalism, know about communism, know what libertarianism is, and all of that stuff. Just have a basic understanding of that. But what I'd really like you to focus on for that chapter is the John Rawls piece. The John Rawls piece involves the veil of ignorance, right? He's talking about principles of justice, economic justice that we'd all agree on if we didn't know anything about ourselves. So the veil of ignorance is where we cloak ourselves ultimately from an original position in this veil where we don't know anything about our race, our gender, our ability, our station in society, and anything that's valued. And from there, we'd come up with principles of justice that would be fair. And then we'd start to create this society. So what Rawls is saying is that if you know these things about yourself, you're not going to come up with fair principles of justice. So he comes up with the two principles. One, the principle of equality, which is really basic in terms of how we understand general equality, that the liberty is compatible and similar for everybody. The difference principle is the important one. And that is that economic arrangements, economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they're to the least advantaged members of society. And what that essentially means is that we can have inequalities, but they have to benefit the least advantaged members. So if you make $10 million, you're going to probably pay taxes, and that's going to go back into the pot to raise up the least advantaged members. And that's the justification for having economic inequalities, and that's something that we would all choose if we didn't know what skills we had and how they were valued in society. I hope that makes sense. Excuse me. So that's the Rawls piece. There'll probably be a few questions on that. That's pretty important. And then there's Nozick. I don't think I'm going to test on Nozick. I'm not sure. I'll go over it real quick in case I throw a couple, you know what? I'm not going to test on it. I'm going to take Nozick off the table. No Nozick is important. There's both Rawls and Nozick are capitalists, but Nozick is a kind of hardcore libertarian philosopher where he sees any type of taxation as like what he refers to as like forced labor, and that there's no entity that has the right to act as an arbiter between exchanges between free peoples, meaning that the government doesn't have a right to like be a third party intermediary between someone who's paying somebody for their labor or something like that. So that's the gist of Nozick. And then the last two are Steinbach and Peter Singer, which you can look at on the videos that I sent you. So probably won't be anything about Steinbach, but there'll definitely be Peter Singer stuff in there. That's the more important piece. Steinbach is responding to Singer. Singer's talking about speciesism. It's the last form of ism, and sentience should be the criteria that we would use, not what member of a species you are to inflict suffering. So there'll be a fair amount of focus on that. And then with regard to the theories, utilitarian and deontological reasoning are going to inform all of these issues. So know something like, Singer's a utilitarian. It's a utilitarian argument, especially because it's dealing with pain and pleasure, like the lack thereof with regard to pain and suffering. An argument in favor of something like euthanasia, like active euthanasia, is a total utilitarian argument, right? Because the whole goal is to reduce or end suffering. The purpose of active euthanasia is to end suffering, so it couldn't be any more utilitarian than that. An argument against euthanasia would be very deontological, like you don't desecrate human life. You have a duty to preserve life no matter what. So you see how that works. So just kind of know that stuff. That's informing all of this. So that's basically the gist. You have those 4 issues, and you have the focal point on James Rachels, Judith Jarvis Thomson, John Rawls, and Peter Singer. Those will be the main philosophers. There might be 1 or 2 questions from the other philosophers, but not a ton. So that's basically the gist. Email me with questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Like I said, the daytime I'm busy, but in the evening I should be able to respond. All right. Good luck studying. I'll see you a week from Friday.